First, they came for the Jews, but I remained silent because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, but again, I said nothing because I was not a communist. After that, it was the turn of the labor activists, but I remained silent once more because I belonged to no union. In the end, when they came for me, there was no one left to protest. These sentences belong to Martin Niemöller, one of the victims of Hitler's brutal dictatorship and one of its most terrifying tools, the Gestapo. Around 90 years ago, an organization was formed in Germany whose name became a symbol of oppression and inhumane torture. That organization was the Gestapo, an abbreviation of Geheime Staatspolizei, or the Secret State Police. The political police force was tasked with continuous surveillance and intelligence gathering to protect the government from threats such as sabotage, subversion, or coups. Authoritarian regimes, like the Nazi regime, often relied on such forces to maintain their grip on power. During the Third Reich, the secret state police had complete control over the residents of Germany and the occupied territories. Though their numbers were not vast, without an army of thousands of informants and collaborators, they could never have expanded their operations to such terrifying proportions. Like many other elements within the power structure of Nazi Germany, the Gestapo had a history filled with power struggles. The organization was constantly influenced by individuals who sought to take control and use its influence and authority for their own purposes. In his first cabinet, Hitler entrusted control of the Prussian state to Hermann Göring. In this position, Göring took control of the police and incorporated the newly established Gestapo, until then part of the SS under Himmler's leadership, into its structure. Göring sought complete control and a unified German police force. However, Himmler had the same goal in mind. Before the Nazis came to power in 1933, Germany was governed by the democracy of the Weimar Republic. The country was made up of several federal states, including Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony, most of which had their own political police forces. The Weimar Constitution guaranteed individual rights and legal protections, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and equality before the law. Political police forces were required to respect these rights, and the Constitution did not allow for arbitrary actions on their part. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Hitler and other Nazi leaders were striving to establish a total dictatorship, and to achieve this goal, they first had to eliminate their opponents. However, there were obstacles in their way. First, the Weimar Constitution was still in effect and prevented arbitrary police actions. Second, Germany's political police had a decentralized structure operating under state and local authorities rather than the chancellor. These two barriers limited Hitler and the Nazi regime's legal use of the political police. For example, in the first weeks of Nazi rule, the regime could not legally order the political police to arrest communists without proper legal backing. But this situation changed quickly. Beginning in February 1933, the Nazi regime used emergency decrees to alter these conditions. The most significant of these was the Reichstag Fire Decree, issued on February 28, 1933. This decree suspended individual rights, including privacy, making it much easier for the police to investigate, interrogate, and arrest political opponents. From that point on, the police could read private letters, eavesdrop on phone conversations, and enter homes without a court order. It is worth noting that the fire at the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, was a deliberate act. Police investigations concluded that Marinus van der Lubbe, who suffered from mental health issues, was responsible for the incident. In fact, van der Lubbe himself confessed to starting the fire, but who may have encouraged him to do so remains unclear. Nevertheless, just one day after the incident, Hitler pressured Hindenburg into signing a decree that revoked constitutional rights and individual freedoms. In the following days, all election activities and publications, except those of the National Socialist Workers' Party and the German National People's Party, were halted. 81 members of parliament from the Communist Party of Germany, along with its senior leaders, were arrested. In less than a month, all opposition was suppressed, heavy censorship was imposed, and trade unions were dissolved. Marinus van der Lubbe was tried and ultimately sent to the gallows. On June 17, 1936, in addition to his position as head of the SS, Himmler was appointed Reichsführer SS and Chief of Staff, gaining control over all police forces in Germany. Following reforms made by Himmler, the name Geheime Staatspolizei was shortened to Gestapo. Despite the notorious reputation the Gestapo quickly gained after its establishment, a ruthless power struggle began between the SS and the SA for control of the organization. The SA, also known as the Brown Shirts, was considered the unofficial army of the Nazi Party at the time. The SA, short for Sturmabteilung or Storm Detachment, had been under the leadership of Ernst Röhm for a long time. He was one of Hitler's closest associates and had played a key supporting role during Hitler's rise to power. However, since Ernst Röhm was appointed chief of staff of the SA in April 1931, numerous rumors about him began circulating within the organization. Supporters of the previous SA leader Hans von Dohnanyi openly expressed dissatisfaction over the appointment of a homosexual man, claiming it tarnished the SA's reputation. Röhm was also accused of using his position for personal gain, and worse, it was said that he placed his sexual partners in high-ranking positions within SA. All these accusations reached Hitler's ears. Nevertheless, Hitler declared that he would not take any action until solid evidence was presented. But these documents were provided very early by the Gestapo. By 1934, the number of SA members had reached around 3 million, and Hitler now saw it as a threat to his absolute power. The SA, which had played a key role in Hitler's rise to power, expected a reward, but now the Führer no longer saw a need for them. On the other hand, the army had conditioned its full support for Hitler on the dissolution of the SA. Eventually, the situation reached a point where a purge became inevitable. The SS and Gestapo compiled a detailed list of individuals who needed to be eliminated. On June 30th, 1934, an event known as the Night of the Long Knives unfolded. Hundreds of paramilitaries were arrested, and SA leaders were executed in their homes. Hitler personally accused Ernst Röhm of conspiracy and played a direct role in his arrest. Röhm was briefly held in Stadelheim prison in Munich. On July 2nd, General Theodor Auck and SS Colonel Michael E. Berti entered Ernst Röhm's cell and placed a revolver on the table. This meant that Röhm was expected to commit suicide. However, Röhm refused and asked to be executed personally by Hitler. The officers waited outside the cell for a while, but when no sound was heard, they returned. They found Röhm having removed his uniform and standing naked in the middle of the cell. At that moment, both officers drew their weapons and shot him 4 times in the chest. The extensive scale of this horrific purge shocked the political and military community in Germany. The fact that the SS, in order to solidify Hitler's absolute power, eliminated even their former colleagues and comrades without the slightest hesitation, had a profound impact on Hitler himself. The SS, which had now become an officially organized entity, despite its small size, operated with far greater efficiency and discipline. Its leadership was under Heinrich Himmler, a figure who was very close to Hitler and highly trusted. Though his appearance resembled that of a simple office worker, his ruthlessness and diabolical genius soon became apparent. Himmler's primary goal was to gain full control over the Gestapo, but it was clear that Göring would not agree to this. Particularly since Göring was an extremely ruthless individual, willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals, from extortion to murder. At that time, Hitler still needed Hindenburg's approval to seize certain powers. However, Hindenburg had become severely ill and aged and had largely lost the ability to manage the country's affairs. After Hindenburg's death in 1934, Hitler took his final step toward total control. He dissolved the presidential system and changed the military oath of loyalty from allegiance to the state to direct loyalty to himself. From that moment on, all political power in Germany was placed in the hands of the Führer, and the fate of the country was entirely in the hands of a man who suppressed any form of opposition in the harshest possible way. As we mentioned earlier, the Gestapo was initially established to monitor politically suspect individuals. However, it quickly became a tool for suppressing all opposition. Within just a few months, all dissenting voices were silenced, and leaders of parties, communists, social democrats, Jews, homosexuals, those who listened to enemy radio stations, and even people telling political jokes were all arrested. In early 1934, amidst escalating internal party conflicts and Göring's increased focus on the development of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, an agreement was made that placed the Gestapo entirely under Himmler's control. In 1936, Himmler officially created a new unified force called the SIPO, or Security Police, by merging the Gestapo, the SD, and the Kripo. In practice, this force was under the command of Reinhard Heydrich, known as the Butcher Prague and the head of the SD. During this period, the Gestapo became a tool of terror against opponents and Jews. The organizational structure of the Gestapo changed several times in the following years, eventually being divided into 10 departments. The main department was responsible for arrests, while the other 9 departments focused on monitoring various political movements. In 1939, the Gestapo became part of the Reich Main Security Office, thus gaining more tools to exert pressure on society. This organization was originally only allowed to interfere in party matters and, to some extent, military activities. However, when it was discovered that a conspiracy against Hitler had formed within the military, the Gestapo took control over surveillance of the Wehrmacht as well. In 1937, the Gestapo's central office, along with its 54 regional branches, had only 6,500 employees. However, by 1944, at the height of its power, the number of personnel in the organization had reached around 30,000. The methods and practices of the Gestapo were, from the perspective of a civil society, completely illegal and brutal. In forced labor camps, people were detained and imprisoned without committing any crimes, simply as a preventive measure. Physical and psychological torture were also common tools of the organization. From 1941, the Gestapo included units responsible for suppressing both left-wing and right-wing opponents, counterintelligence, monitoring the religious lives of citizens, and controlling the media. For example, in the realm of blackmail, prominent foreign political figures visiting Berlin were hosted at a special nightclub with beautiful women, arranged by the Gestapo. This club was fully equipped with microphones and secret photographic devices. The Gestapo owed its widespread influence to the development of an informant system in Germany. Interestingly, many of these informants did not collaborate for money, but volunteered and without any expectations. A neighbor, colleague, friend, or even a family member could have reported to the Gestapo that someone was engaging in illegal or suspicious behavior. The motives of these informants were often ideological, political, or personal interests. However, for those who were condemned, the consequences were severe and terrifying. Gestapo agents had full authority to determine people's fate. Some agents might have acted with leniency and allowed individuals to be released. However, on the other hand, they could have been even extremely ruthless, imprisoning people indefinitely or sending them to forced labor camps. According to Jacques Delerue, a historian and member of the French Resistance, Gestapo detainees were subjected to horrific torture methods. They were hung with their hands tied behind their backs and beaten with fists, clubs, and whips. Their nails and teeth were pulled out, and they were tortured with electric shocks. Even the skin on the soles of their feet was peeled off, forcing them to walk on salt. To extract information, their heads were submerged in cold water until they nearly suffocated, and after repeating this torture several times, the interrogators suddenly changed their approach, offering coffee and cognac in an attempt to force the detainees into cooperation. The only institution that could oversee the Gestapo's decisions was the Gestapo itself. In other words, there was no organization to file complaints against the Gestapo. If there was a complaint, it had to be submitted directly to the Gestapo. As you know, the Nazis viewed German Jews as a racial threat to the German people and the Nazi regime. As part of its mission to protect the state, the Gestapo was responsible for dealing with the Jewish population. The Gestapo's role in anti-Jewish actions entered a new phase with the passage of the Nuremberg Laws in the fall of 1935. These laws strictly prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews. Additionally, extramarital relations between Jews and German non-Jews were considered a crime. The Nazis referred to this as racial defilement. Throughout Germany, special Jewish departments known as Judenreferat were established. One of their main tasks was to investigate violations of racial laws. Additionally, these departments worked on confiscating Jewish property and transferring it to the Nazi state. In 1938, Hitler decided to conquer new territories for the Third Reich. The first step was the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria, during which the country was incorporated into Germany. Hitler paraded through the streets in a triumphant manner, receiving an enthusiastic welcome from the people. However, behind the scenes, the Gestapo was busy eliminating Austria's political opponents. After the Anschluss, more Jews attempted to escape Nazi persecution. In the midst of this, Jews in Vienna were granted permission to leave, but in reality, they were being deported to forced labor camps in Germany. This operation was overseen by Adolf Eichmann, the commander of the Austrian SS. After the annexation of Austria, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. In the Sudetenland region of the country, about 3 million Germans lived, and the Sudeten German Party was filled with Hitler supporters. At that time, many strategists warned that if Hitler occupied the Sudetenland, a major war in Europe would begin. By then, Europe's policy of appeasement had shown that the governments of Britain and France would avoid war at any cost. The French government, not wanting to face Germany alone, followed the policies of Britain and its Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain believed that the demands of Sudeten Germans were reasonable and that Hitler had limited objectives. For this reason, Britain and France advised Czechoslovakia to accept the Nazis' demands. As a result, the Sudetenland was handed over to Germany without a shot being fired. Following that, the Gestapo entered the region and began their cleansing operations. Shortly thereafter, there was no longer a country called Czechoslovakia. Hitler knew that his next step, an invasion of Poland, would not be as easy and bloodless. The Gestapo quickly provided a pretext for the invasion of Poland. 2 Gestapo agents, dressed in Polish army uniforms, attacked a radio station at the border. At that moment, the people of Germany did not know that day would be the last day of peace for their country. 1 day later, when images of the attack were published in German newspapers, the Wehrmacht had already entered Poland hours earlier. Poland was attacked from both sides, by Nazi Germany on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. Meanwhile, the Gestapo was busy identifying and eliminating German communists in the region, as well as those attempting to flee to the Soviet Union. As the occupied territories expanded, the Gestapo realized that new solutions were needed to address the Jewish question. Heydrich initially decided to separate Jews from the rest of society. As a result, they were moved to ghettos, where men and women lived in separate blocks. Amid the chaos of the war, Hitler decided to cleanse his country of all individuals who were not in perfect health. His ideas were rooted in the eugenics movement, which had emerged in the early 20th century. Eugenics, which traces its origins back to Plato, was a movement aimed at eliminating unhealthy embryos and promoting the birth of healthy ones, although its scientific foundations were highly controversial. Individuals suffering from physical and mental illnesses were systematically killed through the T4 program using gas chambers. While exact figures are not available, it is estimated that between 200,000 and 500,000 people lost their lives in this program. Hitler continued his conquest of country after country across Europe. Germany conquered much of Europe using a new tactic known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This tactic involved synchronized attacks by aircraft, tanks, and artillery units simultaneously. Using this method, Germany successfully captured Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and Yugoslavia. In 1941, Hitler was ready to execute one of his greatest plans, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This operation, known as Operation Barbarossa, is still regarded as the largest military operation in history. The Wehrmacht deployed a force of 48 divisions to the Eastern Front, which included 19 armored divisions and 15 motorized divisions. The weapons brought to the front included 3,350 tanks, 7,184 guns and mortars of various calibers, 2,770 aircraft, 6,000 motor vehicles, and 625,000 horses. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Gestapo created a new unit to oversee the occupied territories. This unit, known as the Einsatzgruppen, was under the leadership of Heydrich. 10% of the members of this unit were Gestapo officers, and the other 90% consisted of auxiliary forces from the security police called Schutzmannschaft, who were recruited from local collaborators. The security service forces, the SD, Waffen-SS, and criminal police were also involved. The Einsatzgruppen, in collaboration with the German military intelligence Abwehr and army units, were responsible for the mass extermination of Jews, communists, opponents of the occupation, and anyone whom the Nazis deemed necessary to kill in order to instill terror among the people. In the Soviet Union, the work of the Gestapo was not particularly difficult. According to Hitler, all Slavs were considered racially inferior. However, the main target was the communists. Anyone arrested by them was immediately executed on the spot. The most horrific and deadly crimes committed by the Gestapo during World War II occurred between 1939 and 1945. the war intensified the Gestapo's role, making it more extreme. When Gestapo agents were sent to the occupied territories, they treated the local population with extreme violence. The Gestapo units, along with the Einsatzgruppen, carried out mass executions of Jews and other groups. For example, on the nights of July 12th and 13th, 1942, in Rin, Ukrainian nationalists under the command of SS officers and the Gestapo massacred 5,000 Jews at this location. Some units of the German 258th Infantry Division succeeded in advancing to within 24 kilometers of Moscow on December 2nd. From their position, the Kremlin towers were visible. However, at that very moment, the first winter snowstorm began. The German army on the Eastern Front was not equipped for the harsh winter conditions. The extreme cold caused serious problems for weapons and equipment, and the Luftwaffe was unable to provide the necessary air support for the ground forces. As a result, casualties from the cold and disease were even higher than those from combat, with 155,000 dead and wounded in the last 3 weeks. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, despite the heavy defeat suffered on the Eastern Front, Hitler declared war on the United States. During this time, the Gestapo was at the height of its power. The situation in Czechoslovakia seemed calm, and the people had almost come to terms with the occupation. Heydrich felt so secure that he even went to work without a bodyguard. On the morning of May 29, 1942, while Heydrich was driving from his summer villa to his castle in his Mercedes, he was attacked by a special assassination group from the Czech resistance. At the moment of the attack, the group's leader, Joseph Gabčík, was supposed to shoot at Heydrich's car, but his Sten gun jammed. At that moment, Heydrich ordered his driver, Lucas, to continue driving. However, Heydrich himself drew his weapon and fired at Gabčík. At the same time, another member of the team, Jan Kubis, threw a hand grenade, and the explosion caused shrapnel to strike Heydrich in the back. Heydrich, severely wounded, was transferred to the hospital, but due to severe infection, he passed away on the morning of June 4, 1942, at 4:30 a.m. at the age of 38. Since Heydrich was extremely important to the Nazis, a reward of 100,000 Czechoslovak koronás was offered for the disclosure of the members of the assassination team. In retaliation, 10,000 innocent Czech citizens were executed, and entire populations of 2 villages were completely wiped out. Hitler personally attended Heydrich's funeral and, in his honor, named the operation to exterminate Jews in Poland Operation Heydrich. The violence of the SS and Gestapo in the occupied countries intensified resistance. Assassinations of Nazi leaders, the killing of German officers and soldiers became frequent, and the Gestapo responded to these actions with ruthless vengeance. For every Nazi killed, hundreds of local civilians were executed, regardless of their guilt or innocence. In France alone, about 30,000 people lost their lives in this manner. In January 1943, Hitler appointed a new head of the Gestapo. This individual, a lawyer who had previously managed SS units in Austria, was named Ernst Kaltenbrunner. With a height of 1.94 meters, scars on his face, and a harsh and ruthless demeanor, it is said that even Himmler feared him. Kaltenbrunner was also a longtime friend of Otto Skorzeny, and through his advice, played a significant role in transforming Skorzeny into one of Hitler's favorite agents for covert missions. In the same year, after the heavy defeat at Stalingrad, the German army quickly began losing its positions, while the Red Army achieved successive victories. During this period, the Gestapo's repressive activities intensified more than ever. By that time, the people of Germany had been deceived by false news about the continuous victories of their country. However, when Germany came under heavy Allied bombing, they realized the truth. Under Gestapo orders, talking about defeat became forbidden, and listening to or reading news from foreign sources was considered a crime. Finally, in early May 1945, the war ended with the complete defeat of Nazi Germany. According to the Nuremberg Tribunal ruling, the Gestapo, SD, and SS were recognized as organizations used for criminal purposes. However, not all Gestapo executioners faced justice, and many managed to escape punishment. In 2014, the New York Times reported that during the Cold War, at least 1,000 former members of Nazi intelligence organizations, including the Gestapo, worked for intelligence agencies based in the United States. On September 30th, 1946, the Nuremberg Tribunal found Ernst Kaltenbrunner guilty of war crimes and sentenced him to death for his role in the deaths of many individuals and crimes against humanity. He was hanged in October 1946. Until 1960, Adolf Eichmann, the head of the Gestapo's Section 4, responsible for implementing the final solution to exterminate Jews, lived in hiding in Latin America. 15 years after the end of World War II, Eichmann was captured in Argentina by a team of Mossad agents and transferred to Jerusalem. In 1962, he was tried and executed. However, the fate of Heinrich Müller, the first head of Gestapo, remains a mystery. On May 1st, 1945, he disappeared in Berlin, and his whereabouts have remained unknown to this day. Many Gestapo leaders were sadistic individuals, psychologically speaking. This led even other Nazi party members and the military to despise them. In occupied territories, the Gestapo's terrifying activities were not only ineffective, but also fueled resistance among the local population. After Germany's defeat during their trials, Gestapo leaders displayed unexpected weakness and fear, just as astonishing as the brutal orders they had once issued. The conclusion is clear: no empire of terror, no matter how powerful the machinery of repression, can last forever. Please comment your opinion, and don't forget to like the video. Every video is a journey into the rifts of history.